Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Cram Mackenzie, and I'm the CEO of Wellesley Institute. Welcome to the final session of Advanced 2021, Building a New Normal. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge this land on which Wellesley operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, we are nearly 20 months into living through the COVID-19 pandemic, which has exposed many historic and systematic inequities. And I'm sure many of you have been thinking about how we prioritize equity as we build a new normal. And this is what we've been exploring throughout our virtual symposium series. Over the past 3 weeks, we've explored the inequities that have exacerbated throughout the pandemic and what can be done about them. We've examined the differential impacts of COVID-19. We've examined the housing crisis, and we've examined income inequality. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Nina Ambrose and Michael Torres, who've developed and expertly delivered this symposium series. I'd like to thank all the people who've presented so far, all of those who've enriched the discussion with their questions, and all of those who've given feedback. And of course, I'd like to really thank the 2,000 people who've registered for the symposium. But today we're going to continue our discussion on how to build the new normal with our final topic, and one of the most important topics, climate change and health. We are meeting at the same time as world leaders are gathering together for the COP26 Climate Summit to inspire climate action. But surprisingly, there's little on the agenda about health and health equity. Now, this is surprising because climate change is one of the most significant public health threats of the century. The predicted impacts of climate change include storms, flooding, tornadoes, heat waves, loss of whole islands because of rising sea levels, infections, plagues, insects, mice, scarcity of food and water and resources. And there's been a focus on health impacts such as severe heat, cold, flooding. There have been predicted increase in accidents, injuries, respiratory illnesses, and increased rates of dementia, mental health problems, and heart problems. But the list actually increases every day. One of the things we know about climate change and we know about health problems linked to natural disasters or global heating is that we will not be equally affected. The social determinants of health can and will play a crucial way in the way climate change affects communities and in the way climate change affects health. In today's session, you'll be hearing about problems, but also potential solutions to mitigate the impacts of climate change and health. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to go through a few quick reminders for today. Now, we're going to start with the panelist presentations, and then after that, we'll come back together for a discussion. And I'd like to thank everybody who submitted questions through the event webpage. But if you haven't done that yet, feel free to use a question and answer in the Zoom function, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. And if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, feel free to jump in by using hashtag Advance2021. Well, it's enough from me. Now let's get started with today's presentation. We've got Elliott Cappell joining us from here in Toronto, Ontario. Now, Elliott is a climate change expert with a focus on climate strategy and resilience. He has delivered over $100 million of climate change projects in over 20 countries globally. Closer to home, Elliott has worked with all three orders of government in Canada on climate, most notably as the Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of Toronto. He was recently decorated as one of Canada's Clean 50 for 2022, as a top climate change consultant nationally. Welcome, Elliott. And third, Dr. Sean Kidd, also joined us from here in Toronto. Sean is a clinical psychologist and senior scientist at the division chief of psychology at the Center of Addiction and Mental Health. He is also an associate professor in the University of Toronto Department of Psychiatry. The focus of his career has been on developing and trialing interventions for individuals with severe mental illness and youth who've experienced homelessness. But he's also developed a global network that is looking at the implications of climate change for populations experiencing homelessness. And so I'd really like to welcome Elliott Cappell to give his comments, and we'll start with you. Welcome, Elliott.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you all today. I'm going to use a bit of a different format than the PowerPoint format. I'm going to be referring at times to documents online, things that I think that people who are really interested in climate change might want to read, and I'm going to put those links in the chat as we go. And otherwise, just speak to the points, especially for those who are just listening in their headphones today. So I'm going to talk about three quick things. I'm going to try and define what we mean by the climate change impacts, and then I'm going to try to sort of update that perspective with what we're hearing really like right now this week at COP26. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about what I think we can do about it, or what we ought to be doing about it. Throughout, I'm going to focus on a sort of climate change resilience or impacts perspective. So if you think about, the Earth or the planetary system, you think about us, sustainability or reducing emissions is about our impact on the environment. Resilience is about being resilient to the environment's impact on us. And that's where I'm going to focus today's introduction. So let me first say that the impacts of climate change are fundamentally inequitable. There is a wealth of research and evidence and practice to support this. The way that we think about climate change impacts is basically when we're measuring climate change impacts, we think about it as a function of three variables. The first variable is exposure. So how exposed you are to, or how often or how intensely you're exposed to a heat wave or a flood or so on. Then your vulnerability. So how vulnerable you are, or if the you was a building, how vulnerable is that building? Because the building is older or the building is newer or has different systems. And then the value of what's at stake. If, for example, there's a big flood and my basement floods, what impact does that have on my housing value? Significant. So value is the last component of that. And each of those is fundamentally inequitable. Exposure, some places in the world, there are some communities like South Beach and Miami, which are very highly exposed and also very high income, but it tends to be that both globally and nationally, the places that are at greatest exposure to climate threats tend to be those which are already more vulnerable. For example, in Canada's north. Secondly, the vulnerability. It tends to be that lower income populations globally who have fewer resources to adapt to climate change or to bounce back. They're most vulnerable. And then, of course, the way we measure value is also inequitable. I used the example of a basement being flooded before. If my basement was filled with all sorts of expensive wine and I had it insured, that would be an insured loss, which is something that we calculate in climate change. If I have, as many people were, I started out my life in Toronto by living in a basement. If you're living in a basement and you don't have insurance, then we don't value that in the same way. So whether it's where you are in the country exposed to climate change, whether it's your own vulnerability due to resources or age or health or other social determinants of health, or the ways that we calculate value, the whole picture of how we understand and measure climate change is fundamentally inequitable. But let me put some specifics on that. Of course, this week and last week, world leaders are meeting in Glasgow at COP26 to discuss decarbonization. Decarbonization is, of course, very important to limiting global warming and to keeping us all from the worst impacts of climate change. The first document I'm going to post in the chat here is from the United Nations Environment Program, who released a report this week called the Emissions Gap. And on page 13 of that report, it lays out very clearly that if you look at the commitments that are being made at COP today, even if those were all to come true, that global warming would still continue on. And in 2050, we will have warmed between something like 2.4, 2.7, or 2.8 degrees. So what does that actually mean? Well, the next thing I'm going to post in the chat here is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And on slide 14, they have a list of what it would look like, what scenario are we in with different degrees of warming? And the scenario for those who follow climate change closely is a 4.5 or an 8.5 scenario of warming. These are extreme potential impacts. In looking at a 2.7 degree warming, we would see hot temperatures like heat waves happening 5.6 times as often. We would see a once in a 50-year heat wave happening 13.9 times more often. We would see heavy precipitation happening twice as often, and droughts happening 2.5 times as often, just to list a few. So that's sort of the world that we're looking at in terms of the impacts of climate change. Bringing it a little closer to home, I will share with you some data from what's called the Canada in a Changing Climate Report, which showed that in a extreme climate change scenario, which is the one that we are expecting based on the UN's report, we would see a 50-year precipitation event happen every 20 years or every 15 years. We would see a once in 20-year heat wave happen every other year or every third year. And of course, I don't need to explain to all of you that if that's the exposure, right, if we're being exposed to that many more heat waves or that much more precipitation, it's the people who are most vulnerable who are impacted in their health. And the health impacts are significant. And I will leave it to Sean and others to draw an outline of what those are. But as we think about the impacts of climate change, I think it's also important, here I've mentioned a number of the acute impacts like heat waves or floods. We also need to consider the chronic impacts. That the acute impacts are the things that we sort of think about, wildfires, significant events that are in one day or over several days. But there are also the chronic changes like sea level rise, which is like the slowest moving disaster that you could possibly witness. But if you're in Nova Scotia, for example, sea level rise under today's emissions forecast is expected to be 3 to 5 meters, and 80% of the population in Nova Scotia lives near the coast. And so essentially the whole population is at higher exposure to a potential sea level rise. This varies by region. In the north of Canada and on the coast, of course, sea level rise. In the prairies in BC, wildfire is a very significant risk. And in Toronto, flooding is the #1 risk. It's important also to note that when we think about the impacts of climate change and the drivers of climate change, there is, of course, there are direct, say, health impacts from a heat wave or from a flood. Those are obvious, right? In the acute senses, we see a loss of life or a loss of access to things like electricity or clean water. There are also the chronic things, poor air quality, right, which reduce, of course, our standard of living and our health. And then there are what I would call the things which are climate adjacent: loss of biodiversity, loss of nature, destruction of waterways, things like that, which are environmental impacts, which are related to and caused by climate change. And of course, there are many health impacts of those as well. It's very straightforward to draw a connection between our encroachment into wild spaces and things like the pandemic and other zoonotic diseases. These are, I would say, slightly removed from climate change, but still need to be mentioned within the conversation. So when you think about all the impacts of climate change, our exposure, of course, getting much worse, vulnerability. I'll leave it to Sean and others to speak on. But of course, those who are most vulnerable for the social determinants of health tend to be most vulnerable to climate change. And then, of course, the value and the impact can be quite significant. So, speaking plainly, what can we do about it? And let me divide this first into what we generally can do, and then secondly, what I think we as individuals can do. So the first thing I'm going to share with you in the chat here is from the IEA, the International Agency. This is the big picture, what needs to happen in order for us to reduce the impacts of climate change, reduce our emissions, so that by 2050 we're at net zero. And you see things here like all buildings are carbon ready, car sales are electric, our power sources are renewable. And I think what's really important to keep in mind here is that these are not really individual choices, right? I can't choose my energy mix at my home. I could put a solar panel on, some people have those resources, but ultimately the retrofit of buildings, the changing of industries, the changing of energy production, the changing of supply chains, these are really macro level issues. And the next thing I'm going to share in the chat here is a link to a podcast from Steve Paikin with his guest, Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Canadian climate scientist, one of the world's leading climate scientists, currently residing in Texas. And she speaks a lot about this concept that really a lot of the big changes that we need to make are big, and they fundamentally require a system level change. Another writer who writes a lot on this topic is someone named Michael Mann. He's another one of the world's leading climate scientists. And so when we think about the big things that we need to change to mitigate emissions, they are very system level. And so people say often, what can I do? And I'll get to that in a second. But ultimately, it's important that we don't let off government and industry, because these are very significant system level changes. What can we do to adapt? What can we do to reduce the health impacts of climate change? For me, all of it starts with housing. Sean's going to speak about this further, so I don't want to step on his toes. But ultimately, when you think about a climate event, particularly acute events, we all experience resilience at home, right? It is whether we're speaking about people experiencing homelessness, whether we're speaking about people who live in apartment buildings that don't have access to the proper cooling or heating. It is housing, which fundamentally is a major part of building resilience in any environment in the world to climate change. And I think also we need to speak about community ties. There's a significant body of research, and colleagues at Wellesley Institute have been leading in Canada on pushing some of this out, that demonstrates clearly that stronger communities are very important for building resilience, not just at home, but within the community. And then lastly, because I know I'm running a little bit out of time, trying to move quickly through some of these subjects, there's always the question of what can I do, right? And I said before that the impact that the changes we need to make are system level, and that's true. But there are some things that we as individuals can do. First, we can get informed. Even though I'm neck deep in climate change and working on it every single day, there's just continuous new evidence, new reports, new information. It's such a big fundamental subject that it's impossible to know everything. So I'd say continue to stay informed, listen to podcasts, watch documentaries, subscribe to newsletters. There's one that I particularly like, which I'm going to put in the chat here, from the Financial Times in England, called Moral Money, which is a fantastic review if you're into the business and the finance side, as I am. But subscribe, listen, and stay informed. Secondly, get political. A lot of the decisions that are made around some of these systems level changes, like our energy supply, like how we build housing, these are fundamentally political, and that's a part of the reason why COP26 focuses so much on government commitments. In some ways, the private sector is moving ahead very quickly, very fast, but ultimately we do need government commitments to keep us on track. And then lastly, of course, think about the dollars and cents. Think about not only how you spend your money, your disposable income, and the products and services that you choose, but also very importantly, your savings, right? Are you divested in your RSP if you have one? Are you divested in your savings? If you have insurance products, are those, have you selected the sustainable or green options on those? because fundamentally, one of the biggest shifts that is happening today is the shift of capital away from carbon-intensive industries towards green industries, making it much easier to get green products, services off the ground in markets, and you can help with that with your savings. So that's a quick summary. I realize I've moved quite quickly through a number of topics here, from defining climate change, speaking about some of the global impacts, and then trying to zoom in a little bit on what we can do. I've tried to move quickly through it, but I look forward to further discussion into your questions. Back to you.
Wow. So you covered, that's fabulous. You covered a lot of ground: exposure, vulnerability, value of what is at stake. Some I never cease to be amazed at the how scared I get when I see those statistics and those graphs that you show. That idea of natural disasters, increasing biodiversity, decreasing, but also poor air quality, because there's links into mental health problems with poor air quality, dementia, and depression. But on top of that, one of the things that people don't know is those particulates increase your chance of cardiovascular problems and not only just respiratory problems. And then I was really glad to hear about this idea of what can be done, works both at the macro scale and then what people can do themselves. And you know, the incredible rise of environmental, social, and governance investing. They think by 2030, 50% of all investments in the US are going to be ESG investments, which makes a huge difference to what can be done. So thanks, thank you so much for starting us off like that, Elliott. That's brilliant. And so I want to move to Sean Kidd. So Sean, please, you're next up.
Great, thanks very much, Quam. I'm just going to share my screen here briefly. Just a few slides to just keep my my pandemic-infused brain organized. It's really great to have this opportunity to speak to this topic, which I'm very, very passionate about, and talk a little bit about the origins of the work that I've been doing in this space, and where it's taken me, and where our thinking as a network and a group has been. So where this began, I would say I'm a late comer to this specific table. I've spent pretty much all of my professional life, and even through my education years, spending a lot of time with young people and adults experiencing homelessness, and has spent countless hours sitting out in horrendous heat and wet and cold with people on sidewalks and in parks as they're trying to survive, and struggling with an array of health challenges, physical and mental health challenges, and poverty and exposure to violence. And so it's something that I've been very tuned into for many years. And a connection happened in the early winter in 2019. I was out for a jog. I run out year round, out for a jog. And I find that when I get away from email and get running, I can do some better thinking than I do most of the time. And we're in the middle of, the out of the cold shelters that get set up in places like Toronto. And this is the city level response in many places, is creating cooling and warming centers to try and bring people off of street environments and other inadequately housed situations into safer spaces. And around that time, the Tri-Council, the Canadian group of federal funders, put out a call for this knowledge mobilization grant stream called Living Within the Earth's Carrying Capacity. And it was a terrible timed grant. It's one of those ones, the call comes out in early December and they want everything in early January. And when you reach out to friends and colleagues to get involved, they sort of maybe just hate you a tiny bit for requesting that at that particular time. But nonetheless, we were able to get it together. And what it allowed us to do was to chase down and really start to focus on this question of what is the interface between climate change and homelessness. It's something that the reason I got into this is it just struck me that in all my reading about homelessness for younger people and adults, I'd not seen hardly any connection with climate change and the impacts of weather extremes. And that led down a road to doing some systematic reviews in this space, building a network, and trying to begin to get an organized response to get better information and provide better guidance on this issue, which I think is quite important. So Elliott provided an excellent background on climate change, health, and well-being, and really covered a lot of territory there. I might just tease out a few other things. And so if you haven't seen it, the Lancet Countdown, the most recent Lancet Countdown was published just a few weeks ago. And it really does a nice job of comprehensively walking the reader through the many health impacts, physical and mental health impacts of climate change, and then what we can do about it. And so, both Cappell and Elliott have both spoken to several impacts, both kind of primary, whether it's about the health effects of exposure to heat, airborne particulates, vector and waterborne illnesses. There's an array of impacts, along with, you kind of go down the chain into food and water insecurity, energy insecurity, and then into some of the secondary social impacts, which I'll get into a little bit, is in climate, in heavily climate change affected environments. You see upticks in violence being, whether it's at the whole country or regional war level, or if it's sort of interpersonal violence happening in a given home. So the impacts really cascade, and this report breaks that out quite well. And as has been said quite a bit so far, is this report also really spells out how these impacts, there are many disparities that emerge when considering these impacts, whether these are mental health, social and economic, or physical health impacts. And globally, there's a lot of evidence for the youngest and the oldest, so babies and children, and the elderly suffer and struggle to a far greater extent. This really breaks down along the gender divide, where women and girls globally suffer and struggle much more related to climate impacts, and other domains as well. And of course, these are intersectional. I should not neglect to mention, of course, Indigenous populations globally are amongst the most affected. And in that frame, climate change certainly plays out along the lines of colonialism, those impacts, and cultural genocides that have happened in Canada and elsewhere, as this is really a part of that. And we see some of the most impacted communities and cultures around the world. Certainly in the Canadian North, looking at the melting ice cap and rapidly changing climate there, that is really having major impacts in people's lives, livelihoods, and cultures. And places like, quite recently, of course, in Australia, Indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities, really profoundly affected by the destruction to the ecosystem there from recent heat waves and fires. So a lot to read. This is a great report, a great go-to. I encourage it. And what I thought I would do to get a little more specific is take you down the road of where we landed, which was to really focus on housing and what happens around the issue of homelessness and climate change and all of the weather impacts that come up. So we did a few things. I mentioned, and I'll put in the chat a link to our website where you can find all of our publications. But we did some systematic reviews at a very specific level, kind of validating my suspicion that there wasn't a lot of good information out there on this. At a higher level, looking more at housing and poverty, and those interactions at a systematic review level. And then we were very fortunate that many people around the world responded to, in the midst of the darkest hours of the pandemic, to this email from this guy in Canada who wanted to look at this. And we were able to assemble a global network and do many think tanks over the past year and change. And so this has been a great source of information, and I'll pass a link along to get into the details, but let's cover some of the high level points here. So Elliott really spoke to this well, is climate change is fundamentally one of the main issues is exposure. And I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a more exposed set of populations than people whose housing is fundamentally compromised or who are completely homeless and living out of doors, as populations that are the most exposed to weather extremes, to water and airborne illnesses, to all of the effects of climate change. And this is certainly a problem that is relevant in Toronto, and it's relevant globally with a range of impacts. And I'll get into the model that we came up with about how those impacts happen. Migration is another theme that really emerged in our reviews and in our many conversations. Of course, many people, when there is a weather extreme, whether it's quickly rising water levels, storms, climates and landscapes and farms are really impacted by drought and destroyed livelihoods, people have to move. They are often starving, cannot make a living, and are in grave danger, and try and move with their families. And this is an issue affecting millions globally. And the question is, move to what? And that's where we wanted to follow through with some more information, because there's quite a bit out there on migration, but there's not as much on migrating to what. Often in many parts of the world, it's migrating into slums adjacent to cities, where health and well-being and ability to sustain oneself are further compromised. But in the middle of all of this is the housing piece. It's a running thread throughout. And the last thing I'll touch on in these impacts is this is what public health folks, they're probably the first who coined the term wicked problem. This is fundamentally a wicked problem, in that it's a problem that has many determinants, many interacting aspects, and then many possible outcomes. And that really poses a challenge, because around this issue, even defining a wicked problem as a challenge is what are the parameters, what are the areas of focus? But you could be doing at any one time probably 25 or 30 things to intervene. And these are in resource-strapped contexts. Where and how do you apply an intervention? Because often with wicked problems, you think you have pinned down an area to intervene, and then find that nothing happens because the problem runs on several other channels in parallel. And I think the systems thinking, the complex systems thing, is going to be critical here to identify points of leverage, because in these systems, there are points where you get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of what you, where you intervene. So just a few high-level points. I'm going to show a slide here. It's probably a bit terrible in terms of having too much information on it. But this, I'm just going to cover exposure, and I'm happy to share more on the migration question. But this just kind of maps out how risks flow for populations that are more exposed, like homeless populations. So we've already talked quite a bit about the direct risks, and in our thinking, in our review, we lump these into sort of primary impacts, direct weather-related impacts, and then secondary, which we've already covered in terms of the sorts of risks people are exposed to. But it's in the moderators is where we find those vulnerabilities, those disparities, and the inequitable impacts that people who are inadequately housed, impoverished, and homeless experience. And so obviously there's exposure. There are things like heat island effects. People who experience homelessness are often in downtown cores, in environments which are the hottest in a given city. Obviously dwelling vulnerability. Other moderators that get into the mix here that translate risk into outcomes is exposure to conflict and turmoil. There's some great research out of Australia by Lynn Keevers and others, where they interviewed and spoke with people made homeless by climate change. And they talked quite a bit about how it just amplified interpersonal conflict, everything from domestic violence to just community level violence, chronic illness and malnourishment. So people experiencing homelessness, often the majority experience quite serious physical health challenges and mental health challenges. And so for this already, people whose health and well-being is already compromised in very serious ways, you have these additional pressures happening, which of course you can imagine the loop that emerges in terms of impact. The ability to move. I mean, this is fundamental here. Is for probably many of us on this call. If we faced a profound challenge, we have the social and economic resources to move away from problematic areas or moving to safer spaces and safer locations. People who are impoverished can't do that. I won't go on and on here. The one last bit I will touch on actually is response planning. As we see an absence in attention to populations who are experiencing homelessness and disaster response plans almost uniformly. It's getting a little bit better in recent years. But you have situations where, like in the southern United States, for example, you might have very large hurricane impacts, and emergency and first responders don't really have a plan about how to help out and engage and bring to safety people who are living out of doors. And then the outcomes here, we've talked about, there's lots of evidence around illness, morbidity, people getting sicker, people dying, and this is mental health as well. You see spikes in psychiatric inpatient hospitalizations around weather events around the world. Violence exposure I've covered, and then the ability to respond. So This is a bit of a model, and of course there are all kinds of feedback loops here. And there's something in systems theory called negative feedback loops, where the idea is that it really pushes us towards a prevention lens, because with every step towards greater marginalization, greater poverty, more compromised dwelling, it has an exponentially cumulative effect in terms of the challenges faced by the individual and how harder and how much more expensive it is to respond. So the later we get to these, to support these folks and communities, the harder it is to turn back the dial and bring them back to a space and place where they can be healthy and have a decent quality of life. Home stretch here. I guess, I've reflected quite a bit on what have we learned from the pandemic. We've learned a lot of demoralizing things, and a lot of upsetting things have happened during the pandemic, that's to be sure. We've also, we have a few moments here, a few opportunities to learn something though, I think. One is, there's, as Greta Thunberg spoke about, or COP26, the blah, blah, blah effect. Is homelessness is an area where there's been plenty of blah, blah, blah. And, it's sort of about how hard it is to intervene, how hard it is to make a difference. And we've had Band-Aid and disorganized solutions for years around the world. The pandemic found many countries forming rapid systemic mobilization responses. Many thousands of people brought out of emergency shelter environments into hotels and motels, safer, more hygienic places where people can have a decent quality of life, and leverage that to make some gains when it's impossible to do that if you're street homeless, better access to services and so on. It wasn't without problems, but it did show us what we can do. And then the second thing I'll highlight is the pandemic sure showed us something about interdependencies. Homelessness is a frame where it's often framed as sort of charity for some other people, some people who, if we kind of go down the neoliberal road, we'll think it's their own fault. They made some mistakes or had some individual bad luck. So it's charity for these poor people kind of thing. But the pandemic showed us a lot about our interdependencies and how helping everyone is helping ourselves. And so I think there's some lessons there that could perhaps move us more effectively into the far bigger challenge that we face. And I was asked to speak to a couple of action points, a couple of things. So there are so many things you could be doing. I'm going to touch on two, maybe more will come up in our conversation. But one thing I think that's quite leverage, speaking of leverage, is who's at the table, who's leading the response, who's making the decisions. And I think this is an important question. So there's evidence that when women are there are greater numbers of women in leadership roles in government, you get more robust climate responses. I know there's a lot to that, but that's a piece of evidence that's really worth seriously thinking about who's leading and where things aren't happening and where they are. Indigenous populations being involved in leadership. I've already spoken to Indigenous populations globally as the most effective. Indigenous populations have key roles as custodians of the land and far, far more robust understandings of interdependencies based in across a range of cultures. And really where we're just in much of the world, the public discourse is finally beginning to look a little more seriously at interdependencies. There are cultures where this has been embedded for hundreds and thousands of years and have a far better sense on how we can respond with that lens. And having those most affected involved. Elliott spoke about systems responses and also community level responses. And there's a lot to be said and a lot of importance to communities tailoring and coming together on approaches at the local level that will make a difference for those most affected. And that's a point of engagement we need to think about. And then lastly, getting upstream, prevention's key. We don't have homeless people exposed, and when we don't have homeless people, and in a place like Canada, it's absurd. We have people who are chronically homeless, and we can't find approaches to housing and climate resilient housing. Globally, on the migration front, it's about planned migration or facilitating people staying in place safely. These are prevention oriented approaches that pay dividends downstream. Gary Belkin out of New York and the Billion Minds Institute is another great example of looking at trying to build community level mental health resilience that prepares us collectively to be action oriented here. The last thing, Elena, what can an individual do? I completely agree with what Elliott said on all fronts. The only couple of other things I might add is, we all might feel a little and I'll put my psychologist hat on here, we can get feeling really helpless and feel like we have no efficacy in this area. It's so large scale, can seem so out of control, so systems embedded. And fundamentally, despair won't help anybody. And we need to be informed, but we also need to, I think, have some hope and have a sense on what we can do. And as psychologists will often talk about, process is an outcome. And so while greening our front yard and rolling out the compost bin, these and having conversations with neighbors might seem like puny efforts in the face of what requires a systems response and a global response that Elliott spoke about. We are also in cultures, and being a part of the culture of change and contribution. My tiny front yard might not do much of anything, but it's a signal, and it speaks to other people. And this is a people situation to engage, so people vote, so people become political, as Elliott spoke about, and living my reality now. Someone's at the door. I'm just going to ignore that. And then the next thing I might just touch on is who's the next generation here. We've my generation and generations prior have really baked up a tremendous disaster. And how can we have hopeful, engaged young people with the right skills to tackle this? I think we really need to concentrate on that, as that infrastructure from social to cultural to educational and everything in between. I will stop there, and I'm really looking forward to where we go next with this conversation.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Sean. They're fabulous, covered a huge amount of ground. I really like the idea of moderators, which give us targets for change. I like the idea of staying positive and being part of the process, getting political and getting young people out. But that who's at the table is going to be really important, and how we get upstream. Loads of I'm sure we'll get Elliott back, because there's going to be so much to discuss about this at the moment. But while we're getting Elliott back, I just wondered one thing to ask both of you. I know, Elliott, you've been doing this a lot longer, and Sean a shorter period of time, but I'd be really interested to know on your journey what the biggest surprises have been, the things that have surprised you most, maybe starting with you, Elliott.
Oh, that's a big question. I think, the thing that has surprised me the most, I guess I would say, over when I think about my career to date in climate change, I'll do one kind of big picture one, and then one specific, if I may. When I started, and up until even 18 months ago, the climate change and sustainability and environment people were like, okay, go sit in the basement somewhere and consider the environment before printing this email. And as much as there are, it's imperfect, and there are many claims of greenwashing and all the rest of it, Mark Carney led a group of investors this week to say that they're going to spend $130 trillion on climate change. Government's committed $100 billion in climate aid. So to me, one of the biggest kind of surprises is the way that we've taken something which is, yes, it's self-interested, but it's environmental and social, and moved it to the very center of capitalism in the world. And to me, that's maybe a bit high level, but it's been a real surprise to me every time I see a big, name a big company that doesn't have a big climate change commitment. I dare you to find that company. And then the other thing that, as Sean was speaking, I was thinking back to some of the work that I did earlier in my career, which is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And, one of the biggest challenges that we have in climate change is data, right? It's very hard to get very local data around, where flooding is going to happen in X neighborhood in Toronto or Calgary or wherever. And when I was working in Zimbabwe, what we found is that the local communities, through indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, had much better data than we did. So they could say, yeah, this river used to come up to this place, that's why our land starts here and why we started our farming here. And now the river only goes up to that spot. And so we've moved further down, which is encroaching on the river and causing impacts downstream. And I would say that experience of seeing the way that local knowledge and indigenous knowledge can trump scientific and technical knowledge in the fight against climate change to me was probably one of the other kind of big, for me, you know, younger in my career at the time, was a very surprising realization.
Okay, thank you. And Sean, what's been most surprising for you on your journey?
Yeah, so I guess one negative surprise and one positive surprise I'll put out there. On the negative side, you know, I think, you know, I like many folks, you know, heading into, you know, up to the period up to the last couple of years, thought I was fairly informed, you know, read the New York Times, followed what was happening with meetings, read my Naomi Klein. I felt like I was an engaged citizen and trying to do my best at a local level, thinking about what I'm doing when I'm voting. But I think what happened in doing the systematic reviews and having many conversations with people around the world is maybe others can resonate, is the scope and scale of this problem is breathtaking. I thought I knew something, but the deeper dives, it just really showed everything, you know, in the homelessness frame, the millions of people who are into forced migration, overlays with political violence, and just the utter lack of organization around it. And it's everywhere from data to just, you know, many of these, we've got some fantastic climate science that should really enable us to be able to get ahead of problems and support people so they don't end up with families dying in slums in places like Kenya and elsewhere, and you know, dying in the Canadian West just this past summer. It's breathtaking. It's one of those scenarios where you think you kind of have a handle on something, and then it's just, wow, it's a breathtaking problem, and something that I thought I would have been, you know, a little bit more in tune with, but with digging that came up. The second thing is just how engaged the communities are surrounding these issues, people willing to step in and step up. Like in the middle of the pandemic, you know, I've run research studies in a range of topics over many years, and we all have had the experience of sending out emails and you don't really hear, and, you know, people are kind of like, I don't know, here's another thing. Middle of pandemic. But I was able to, within a matter of weeks, have a collaborative group of about 30 policymakers, scientists from nearly everywhere in the world come together, saying, we agree this is important, let's get together on what we can do on this. And that's something I've not experienced before in research. Usually it takes a lot longer to build relationships and get started with something. So I think for myself, those were a couple of surprises.
Yeah, so the size, but also the urgency, but also the fact that people are doing things, and sort of for them with Elliott, the local knowledge, as well as just how, similar to you, how things get done. The fact that I suppose no one could be that surprised that capitalism wants to continue, and consequently people want to save their profits. But the fact that they're willing to put so many trillions into the pot in order to save the planet is astonishing. I think what I heard from Elliott was because it's happened so quickly. Yeah, I mean, Mark Carney's been sort of out of the Bank of England for like a year or something, right? So. So there are some questions coming from the audience, and we're going to go to those. We try and get through as many as possible. And it's really, how do you get a sense of societal responsibility to be more human and helpful with action versus apathy? So this is sort of bigger than the climate change itself. It's more asking in general, listen, this is so big, you know, you're saying it's so big, Sean, it's so big, it could just stop us and we could just get apathetic. How do we keep on that sort of thing that you were talking about, staying positive, being part of the process, sort of taking one step at a time to move things forward? How do you get people out of apathy into action?
I'd be happy to jump in. I think Elliott will no doubt have a lot to say about this one as well. You know, it's like that balance between being informed and, like I mentioned, you know, seeing the scope and scale can make an individual feel like whatever they might come up with is a drop in a bucket, and, you know, better just to kind of ignore it or just feel hopeless about it all. I think there's a lot to be said about examples of community-driven responses where you do see things happening. So, you know, in work out of Australia around the fires there, many communities really rallied, came together, and were able to do a lot more than just kind of handing out water bottles, but really engage on issues, support one another, come up with strategies, and engage government. So like a lot happens there. So I think, you know, while our media tends to really, and as you know, as it should, is drive home the very frightening impacts and statistics. I think we need more of you know, where there are community level projects, initiatives that have been impactful, where you could kind of put yourself in there and imagine yourself contributing to that and making a difference, and then tying it together with, you know, many communities doing that and out to global impact. But I think we haven't had as good a job done on that side of things. And that's where, you know, I think if we're going to have more people engaged, I think we do need to kind of lay out a path that makes sense and is representative. And of course, across a wide range of contexts. As a global issue, there are so many communities and people involved.
Elliott, did you want to add on to that? Fabulous answer, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I put a link in the chat earlier of an interview with a woman named Catherine Hayhoe. She's, as I said, a Canadian. She's a leading climate scientist who's also deeply religious and currently lives in Texas. And she talks about, she talks about communicating about climate change. And she always says you have to think about the other, you know, whoever you're communicating with, to think about their values. Because ultimately we can explain until the world's end why this is important or why it's in people's interest. You know, ultimately, if we're going to make significant change and take big responsibility, you know, it has to be a values-driven conversation for many people. And I would encourage you to listen to either that interview or just to Google Catherine Hayhoe and read a little bit about her approach. It's a fascinating story of ingesting societal responsibility in the places that you may expect climate change to be rejected out of hand.
And so I'm looking forward to that, and hopefully I'm sure we'll grab everything out of the chat and circulate it. It's interesting that to a certain extent, linking to Sean, is is sort of the motivational interviewing approach. So when we as clinicians were trying to decrease the impacts of substance use, sort of many years ago, what we would do is we'd stand on one side and say, you just got to give up. And you remember Reagan and all of that saying, just say no, right? And that stuff doesn't work very well. And so what people found is, rather than just saying, just say no, they would say, hey, well, just a second, where are you? Yeah. Are you pre-contemplative before thinking about giving up? Have you contemplated this? Have you started and then had it didn't work out? Or are you raring to go? And actually what you say to people and what you do with people and how you approach people changes depending on where they are. And that's this sort of classic motivational interviewing approach, that rather than staying there and just saying, just say no, you take people's hands and you help walk them through, right? And so I'm hoping that I'll see the sort of religious Texan Canadian sort of talk about that. But one of the things that also, Sean, that came out from your response was there was actually some advice that came during the pandemic about not spending too much time watching scare stories or the sort of the numbers go up, and actually that the news would do us all sort of a favor if they did exactly what you said with climate change. Do some positive stories, tell people what they can do, give people control rather than just scaring them. And I'm wondering if that's what you're saying would be useful as well for sort of climate change.
Yeah, I'd agree. Like and it gets me thinking about there's a whole set of a very nuanced set of expertise about effectively communicating with people, motivating them. Certainly psychologists have a hand in, usually at the individual level. Advertisers are phenomenally effective at getting people to do any range of things, from quite harmful things right through to good things. But I do wonder, and certainly in my scope, like I'm not the best person to sell this. I really am not. It's not my skill set. I can do systematic reviews. I can, organize think tanks. I can do all that. But, like in my neighborhood here, how do I convince Parkdale that we should try and contribute? I think that's a piece I think we would be great to see more action in, is engaging the best and brightest and smartest on how we have this, as you say, that approach that indexes to where individuals and communities are at, pre-contemplative through to frightened and wanting to do something, across cultures, across geographic contexts. I mentioned the wicked problem systems piece is identifying where those points of leverage are and figure out what are the right messages, who are the stakeholders, and gosh, our social media platforms would have a long way to go to become helpful here. Perhaps I'm being a little cynical there, but how they can engage. So I think this is something that, we've got the science, many smart people on the science side involved, but I think we could use a lot more smart people on the messaging, convincing, communicating end of things.
Okay, so let's move to a different question. One for you, perhaps, Elliott. So this is a question that's come from the chat. What do you determine to be the main cause of global warming / cooling? Hasn't chemical agriculture destroyed most of the nutrient-dense soil, whereas Earth's soil are the lungs of the planet? Doesn't the planet go through a cycle of heating and cooling, of high and low carbon emissions throughout the millennia?
Well, okay, I'm not a climate scientist, but so I'm going to basically parrot what my climate science colleagues tell me, which is that, and it's an interesting question, because when we talk about climate change, which is such a complex issue, and then we can talk about, say, environmental or planetary boundaries, right, which bring in things like, which bring in a wide variety of other things. Ultimately, the main cause of global warming is our burning of fossil fuels. Depending on how you look at it, it's between 2/3 and 3/4 of the problem. And so we kind of distract ourselves, because this is such a complicated problem, by looking at all sorts of other things. But the simple answer to the main cause of global warming is burning fossil fuels. Now, the question also raised an important point about agriculture. We don't talk about agriculture enough. Agriculture is, of course, part of the problem that we're talking about in terms of global warming. It's also, our process of agriculture is part of other problems of destroying soil, biodiversity loss, making us unhealthy in many other ways. And there's a big movement towards regenerative agriculture, which makes agriculture part of the solution. Healthier environments, right? More biodiverse environments. And of course, soil, trees, and the ocean being able to absorb various greenhouse gases that then cool the planet. So what's the main cause? Burning of fossil fuels. And is agriculture part of the question? Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And just for the person who's written, one of the things about some of these ideas and myths are that they do have an element of truth. So does the planet go through cycles? Yes. Has chemical agriculture been a problem? Yes. But as you say, all of those, whether you say yes or no to those things, it's fossil fuel burning, right? That's causing our problem at the moment. So we've got another question, and just to show that, not to show, but nobody gets an easy ride at Wellesley panels, because we have a really wonderfully engaged group who ask the questions that everybody's thinking about. Lots of suggestions for action are orientated to what we can do as individuals, which is good. But at the same time, when only 20 companies are responsible for 70% of the emissions, Might it be misguided to focus on individual actions? So, Sean, Elliott, both of you want to jump in there?
I'll jump in real quickly. I mean, you know, first of all, I agree with a lot of the sentiments there. Individual actions are good. I'm not sure that only 20 companies responsible for 70% of the emissions, but the sentiment I agree with. These are systems level changes, right? We don't have all of the choices, right? They aren't available to us, even if we have the resources to choose necessarily the lowest forms of energy or sustainable transportation or sustainable agriculture. We do need to focus on the big system level changes. And one of the links I shared is from an author named Michael Mann, who's one of the most celebrated climate scientists in the world. He came up with a theory called the hockey stick curve. So he's not Canadian, but he's like being Canadian. And this is exactly his narrative as well, shared by this anonymous attendee. One of the stories that he often cites, which is early on in his most recent book, is that do you know who made the first ever personal carbon footprint calculator? An oil company. Because they wanted to suggest that if you as individuals could reduce your own carbon footprint, everything would be fine. So not exactly sure that it's 20 companies responsible for 70% emissions. And I do think it's good if we all take our action, show it on our own front yard. But I agree with the sentiment. You know, these are system level issues that require system level solutions.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I think there's a real needle to thread there about somewhere between the hopelessness. I'm going to put my head in the ground and I can't do anything about this. There's also, you know, the trap of thinking that rolling one's compost bag out to the sidewalk is enough. I've done my bit, and it isn't. And then also, you know, laying out ways that people can, as Elliott put it, get political, along with being informed, is vote in impactful ways, engage in advocacy in impactful ways, those kinds of things. It's Naomi Klein writes quite well about, you know, with a pretty strong neoliberal lens about the pitfalls of that individualist sort of thinking. It's a trick. It's a real trick, I think, to navigate these dynamics that produce communities of people that are, you know, doing everything from stuff in their front yard through to being really active in the global conversation and voting the right people in who can make those system changes.
Okay. So next question. So I think I really like this idea of it's not either or, it's both and, because if we're in this difficult situation, it's all hands to the pump and all levels that we all need to work out. Climate change is typically presented as an environmental issue. It is not so frequently considered as a health issue, but it seems like this is a way to make it something that is closer to home. How can we raise awareness that our health is already being impacted by climate change and it will just get more impacted? Sure.
Sure. I think there's a lot to be learned from public health, the field of public health, and efforts over many years to highlight and communicate to people that you know, that things like lack of exercise and smoking and all these things are impactful for our health, and here's how they are. So I think there are quite robust literatures and fields on how best to communicate those risks. I think the urgency challenge is certainly here. Like people will be familiar with the decades-long gap between publishing something on a risk and anything much happening at your local hospital around it. But I think that a public health approach will be important. I think as well, you know, trying to weave things together. So, you know, it can be portrayed as there's a crisis, you know, out in British Columbia. Hundreds of elderly people died in the heat wave. You can kind of see that in isolation, but not be able to relate it to the heat impacts in a place like Toronto or in South Carolina or elsewhere. But I think just trying to get the narrative right about connecting the dots about health risks and the themes of climate change and how that's impacting people's lives. You know, I think it's just such a huge question. And the other thing I would highlight is the mental health end of things as well. Is this where, like, I think you'd be hard pressed to find, you know, much more than a small minority of any community that's not at least a bit stressed about this. And it falls on the heel, like the pandemic has really shaken, put a psychology hat again, like we're kind of, us humans are fairly simple creatures. I think the climate change problem sure demonstrates that. But we have our straightforward narratives about how our lives run, about how the life course will go, what we expect will happen from day to day. The pandemic, I think, has really ruptured that narrative about, and narratives are, I'm generalizing here. There are many narratives in parts of the world where that isn't the case, but it is the case often. And out of that pandemic, a lot of stress happened. A lot of people's lives, sense of self, sense of culture is shaken. And I think we have an opportunity, speaking of, how we can roll out of the pandemic. Things have been disrupted. And I think people might be a little more open to the notion that global things can happen, like climate change, that will have massive impacts on the health and well-being of ourselves and those we love, because we just experienced it with the pandemic, change the frame, and we receive a bigger problem and more long-lasting problem with climate change. So I do think it's a matter of, if there's a theme here of weaving narratives to highlight connections between a huge thing like climate change and impacts. And I should say as well, kind of speaking in a bit of a Canada-centric frame, this is an area where there are parts of the world where the impacts are every day and out your front door, and people are feeling it and living it. So there's no convincing needed there. But in the most polluting parts of the world, there's a lot of convincing that's probably needed.
Okay. And Elliott?
I don't have a coherent answer. I just have a bunch of thoughts. It's a very interesting question. So I'll just list them quickly. I think, first of all, when we're thinking about this, we can divide between the chronic impacts of climate change, like decreasing air quality, and the acute impacts, which may also be poor air quality from something like a forest fire. But those are different things that require different messaging. When we think about a heat wave, newspapers often use the image of like a child playing in a splash pad. And when we talk about storms, it's like some angry apocalyptic lightning bolt or something of that effect. And the latter is much more frightening and much more attention grabbing, better for raising awareness than the former. And so there's something about the messaging between the chronic and acute, which is important. I think this is maybe a broader question or a question back. There's a bigger picture question of the role of let's say, our awareness of health versus wellness in the context of the pandemic, and trying to, as we come out from the pandemic, and rethink how we communicate and how we care for people in the healthcare system, the pandemic, the relation of climate change, trying to make that link between the bigger global forces, like what caused the pandemic, and then what we feel at home. So that's the second sort of aspect of it. And then the last thing, there's the person who wrote this said something very interesting. They said, how our health is already being impacted by climate change. And I actually think that's much more important than the question of how it will get impacted in the future. Because I sit here and tell people that the world's going to end in 2030 and 2050, nobody seems to care, right? When it's air quality is going to be down tomorrow when you want to take your kids to school, or air quality is down today when you want to go running, that's what people care about.
Yeah, and there have been communities that have taken their city government to court because their city government has not protected their health by protecting the air quality. And that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years, that people have started saying to their governments, you are not doing enough to protect our air. And they've been winning their court cases. And so that's sort of people doing things today to really not only bring attention, but actually change it. It is completely possible. It's an interesting question. Going back, I think this starts back to you, Sean, because it's about youth. I know you were saying get young people involved, but this question is Glasgow COP26 has provided great action steps, but the involvement of the young seems ready to create a hopelessness backlash. Do you agree? Blah, blah, blah.
Blah, blah, blah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess mine goes in a few different directions. I think like this is speaking of, the need of a whole systems response, and Elliott really nicely laid out, things like industry and finance sectors and all of these sectors that need to come into play is sort of thinking about the cultural and social whole system response that we need. And I would suggest that sure, young people and given the statistics Elliott laid out, it is quite rightly so, are pointing out that perhaps there's too much blah, blah, blah in Glasgow and not enough action to get us towards targets that aren't going to be, horrendously impactful. But angry young people have been behind social change many times in the past, groups of angry young people. You see, certainly, as at times misguided as it was, the counterculture movement in the late 60s, caused change, and perhaps some of the messages and the pieces didn't totally connect, but it did cause change. It caused people to think, and these are impacts and effects, social effects that are happening. My daughter, as probably within the last 2 days, has been telling me how pissed off she is about climate change. She's got the tiny book by Greta Thunberg. She's reading about it. And this is, I think, impacts everybody. And, while we might not completely agree with everything that's said, I think that's fine. I think having young people angry, shaming kind of works in some contexts, making people feel ashamed of themselves, thinking about subsequent generations. Yeah, no, through history, Second World War, many different times, there have been angry young people who've made a difference with messages that might on the surface sound sort of hopeless. That's my opinion anyways.
We've got lots of questions coming through, so I want to rush through. I'm going to go one and then one. So Elliott, how can we pressure big corporations to make the important changes that are needed?
So I think this is something we work on a lot, and there's no one answer, but I'll give two quick ones. The first one is to focus companies to disclose. All big companies, especially public companies and investors, they make financial disclosures. And now we're forcing companies to disclose on ESG also. So not just the record on the environment and climate change, but also anti-bribery, governance, slavery, health impacts, all those sorts of things. That's very important because when you shed a light on it, people will change. And then the other side, of course, is finance, right? The investment flows that we're talking about. Ultimately, if we all say, okay, I only want my savings to be used on, or I only want my pension to be used on, green products or sustainable solutions, money will move and industry will follow.
Okay, so we're looking at investment as well as other things. So here's a question, quick answer from both of you. Without the Paris Accord and Kyoto, we would be on track for global warming of 4 to 6 degrees. How do we message that progress has occurred, but we need to scale our efforts? Fair?
That is the message. I love that question because you've asked a great question, but also provided the answer yourself. Steve Lurie, with your permission, I'm gonna use that.
Okay, perfect. So we know that climate change is happening and there might be devastating impacts around the world, whether through loss of housing and even loss of lives in many countries. But how will climate change impact us here in Toronto? What can we do to prepare? Are there specific programs or services that we should focus on? And so that's your wheelhouse, Elliott, and your wheelhouse, Sean. Sean, you go first and then Elliott.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll let Elliott speak to the specific impacts at the city level, because I think he's got a great deal of expertise there. I think in terms of actions, I would call attention to the many points I made around equity and who are the most impacted. So, for example, efforts to make cities more climate resilient through better, green coverage, trees, those sorts of things, often haven't included in that dialogue the issues of equity. And what you see is some of these plans can backfire and create greater gentrification, more housing access issues, those sorts of things. So I think encouraging and asking questions about who's involved in these efforts to foster city level resilience. I think at a city level, I think this can kind of come back to some of the individual things we can do about addressing issues in our homes to make them more climate resilient. and I guess advocacy at the government level is about who we vote in, asking questions about where is the climate change mandate in your local city councillors' conversations about what they plan to do in office. But I am going to pass it to Elliott because I do think he'll have a lot more to say about this.
Yeah, I could do this though. I could do the whole session on this question, but I've just pasted in the chat a link to the Climate Atlas, where you can see some of the exposure, right? What we're going to be exposed to more, flooding and heat waves and so on. Look at that if you're interested. And for anywhere in Canada, by the way, on the Climate Atlas website, how it impacts here in Toronto. I'm just going to narrow down the answer to buildings. Okay, buildings are our largest source of emissions: heating, cooling, and electrifying buildings. They're also, buildings are homes, or in some degree offices, but mostly homes. That's where we feel the impacts of climate change. It's renters live in the older apartment towers that are already hot, that will feel the heat waves. It's people, renters living in basements, who will feel the impacts of flooded basements. It's the people, the population experiencing homelessness, who experience all of these events. So fundamentally, I think housing is the biggest source of our emissions. It's also how we feel the impacts of climate change. So it all has to go through our homes. Simply put, the new stuff we build is easier to make resilient and low carbon than it is to make the stuff that's already been built retrofit to be low carbon and resilient. So, okay, so we go from housing, okay, it's retrofitting what we already have. That's kind of the biggest challenge. City of Toronto has a great program called Tower Renewal, which has had a bit of a storied history, hasn't really gotten the attention that I think it deserves. Fundamentally, again, if we keep filtering narrow, buildings are the biggest. It's the existing buildings, and then it tends to be the older rental apartment towers, which both in terms of, they're leaky, they consume a lot of energy, but also they tend to house some of our lowest income and most vulnerable populations. So to me, it runs through buildings, through existing buildings, and then particularly through older rentals.
Okay, so another question, because I think that's a comprehensive answer. And as you say, we could go on and on about what the city could and couldn't do. And I really like the fact that you brought it back to the fact that it's not just what we do, but who we do it for. And so that there is an inequity here, which goes down your idea of exposure, vulnerability, and value, that being important. So this is, I think, for you a bit, Sean, but I think, Elliott, you probably want to jump in as well. Can we speak to the role of the land back movement, can we speak to the role or impact that the land back movement has to combating climate change? Dr. Kidd did speak briefly earlier about the importance of work being done by Indigenous communities. I'd love to hear a wider discussion on Indigenous land sovereignty and how we can all support this. And, obviously in this situation, none of us can speak for Indigenous populations. And so we're taking an allyship perspective here. But do you want to jump in there, Sean?
Sure. It's a great question. And I will speak a little bit to things I've seen on the more the process and the process of engagement end of things, and I guess in Canada, I don't know if probably in this call there are people from other parts in the world, but in Canada there's been a movement towards what's been referred to as truth and reconciliation, is trying to create a better understanding and study of the colonial impacts and cultural genocide that has happened in our country, and has laid out some steps to address it. But I do think that engagement is going to be fundamentally challenged if the communities and individuals engaged are still actively experiencing systematic discrimination. I think across the board, there's a need to do the work. There's clear guidance on what to do to cultivate the health, respect, and trust of Indigenous communities. And I think without those foundations, the engagement is just not going to work. We've got, speaking of blah, 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 there's a lot of sort of tokenism, and there's a lot of inviting, the term might be inviting people to tables, those sorts of things, but very little action in many aspects of how we're trying to right the injustices and the traumas that have been caused. So I think there's a process piece here that we need to work hard on and get right before, and that's going to be tied to any engagement. I've already said what I think is the sort of more obvious pieces about Indigenous leaders and communities being an active and respected and with the advice given, acted on leadership roles in our response. And I think, the discussion about land stewardship it's really in the middle of it all. But I have a hard time, and again, speaking as and identifying clearly as a non-Indigenous person, I have a hard time seeing how that will happen unless we get some other fundamental stuff right and do a lot better. But I'll pass it on to Elliott.
No, I mean, that was a very thorough response. I think what the question mentions, some of the important work being done by Indigenous communities, and I would say here in Canada and abroad. One of the ways that I see it as sort of a climate change professional is through the role of Indigenous and local knowledge, which I touched on a little bit earlier, but there are some amazing things happening through approaching climate science and climate information from a different lens, from an Indigenous knowledge lens. And so I sort of think I have a hard time getting my head around the biggest picture of this issue. But when I look at some of the individual aspects like that one, I see a lot of progress.
Perfect. I'm trying to get us to what looks like, I think it's going to have to be the last question, and it's going to need really quick answers, and it's yet a huge question. How do we reconcile the fact that both the impacts of climate change and resiliency solutions will lead to land enclosures, e.g. building new housing, clean/green energy infrastructure, increasing urban green space, nature-based solutions, mining/resource extractivism for clean tech, and all of these things may further entrench unjust access to land. How do we think about that while centering the health and well-being of Indigenous clients and patients, as well as our future clients and patients? And unfortunately, you've got about 1 minute each on this. And I apologize, but we're coming right to the end. Elliott, then Sean.
It's a big question. If I just had to pick one thing out, I'm going to steal from Sean. I really like what he said that, we have to think about who's around the table. And ultimately, if you're thinking about entrenching injustices or not considering the things that matter to people like health, if you put those people around the table in the decision-making and ensure that they're there with a voice, then you've got a hope.
Yeah, my 1 minute, I would just say that we need evidence-based approaches. And I think there are opportunities to study over time community responses, city level responses that are impactful and those that are less impactful, and have a formula. I don't think each city and community should or could really be, or should be going forward, kind of making it up on their own. I think we really need to learn about from processes that work and implement them where they're likely to work and get more systematic about it.
Okay. So, I mean, we're coming to the end of our times. I wondered if either of you had one last thing that you wanted to say before I close up, or are you good?
I'll say one quick thing. There's a question we didn't get to where Charles asked, are we quite simply doomed? When you look at the forecasts and the projections, Charles is probably right, but forecasts and projections have been wrong before. And if you think about past crises that we faced, some things like, AIDS in Africa as an example, or, the way the world was on March 10th, 2020 versus the way the world was on March 14th, 2020, I think we can show that big systemic change is possible. So sure, if we put down that cerebralness, as Charles puts it, you could think of us as being doomed, but I would keep with the optimistic.
Thanks for that. And I wasn't given that question to ask. And I would imagine it's because it's not what we do as humans. We've always had huge problems that we've tried to get over. This may be a very big problem, but what we don't do is give up. We try. And I believe that actually this problem is surmountable. And, you know, we've been talking for 1.5 hours today. It's been a fabulous discussion for Elliott and Sean. And it is a big problem, but we've heard so many solutions. In fact, we have talked about climate change, health, equity, psychology, marketing, business, international finance, housing, Indigenous sovereignty, young people, gender issues, and what we can do at an individual, community, and national levels to intervene. We've talked a lot, and that's because there are loads of ideas out there. And I think that with that depth of knowledge, there's much that we can start thinking a bit more positively about. I'd like to really thank you both, Elliott and Sean, for what's been a fabulous 1.5 hours. I'd like to thank everyone who's attended virtually. And I'd like to say this brings Advanced 2021 to an end, and a great way to end with such a fabulous discussion. It's fair to say that this is our first ever virtual symposium, and we think it's been a success with about 2,000 people registering. I'd like you to stay tuned for post-event content and the recordings that will be available at wellesleyinstitute.com by the end of the month. Also, if you want to stay up to date with Wellesley Institute's work, and they're interested in our next one, which will be Advanced 2023, our next conference, you can sign up for our newsletter. A sign-up link will be shared in the chat. And a final reminder that as soon as we finish here, there's a short survey that will appear on your screen in your browser. We'd really appreciate your feedback on today's event because we want to make things better. So I'd like to thank Nina Ambrose and Michael Torres, who have been curating and working on this event and have made it such a success. I'd like to again thank Elliott and Sean, just brilliant work. And I'd like to thank you all. And we hope to see you again at Advanced 2023. Goodbye.